Hey guys, tonight we're leaving behind the soft glow of your phone screen, the gentle hum of your refrigerator, and the reassuring solidity of your modern bed. We're stepping, or perhaps more accurately, being unceremoniously dumped into the mud, the grime, and the sheer, unadulterated reality of medieval times. Picture this: you're not a knight in shining armor, not a fair maiden in a tower, but just you, plucked from your Netflix binge and dropped into a world where survival isn't guaranteed. It's a daily, desperate struggle. A world so utterly alien, so fundamentally hard, that your modern sensibilities would likely crumble faster than a stale biscuit. You probably wouldn't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Alright, settle in, because your journey back in time starts right now, and trust me, it's less of a gentle stroll through a picturesque village and more of a face-first dive into a muddy ditch. Forget everything you think you know from movies or fantasy novels. This isn't a place of grand quests and chivalry, not for you anyway. You're just here, dropped into a world that operates on entirely different principles, where comfort is non-existent, and simply making it to tomorrow feels like winning the lottery. The air itself feels heavy, thick with unfamiliar smells and the palpable weight of centuries of human existence, mostly lived in pretty grim conditions. Your first sensation is likely the ground beneath your feet, probably not smooth pavement, but uneven, possibly muddy, definitely organic. You look around, and the buildings aren't crisp, clean lines of brick and glass, but rough-hewn wood, wattle and daub, thatch roofs, leaning slightly, looking like they've grown out of the earth rather than been built upon it. The sounds are different too, the distant clang of a blacksmith, the bleating of sheep, the chatter of unfamiliar languages, maybe the barking of a dog that looks suspiciously wolf-like. This is your new reality. No instruction manual, no helpful villagers eager to give you the lay of the land, mostly just suspicious stares, and certainly no convenient store for supplies. You arrive with nothing but the clothes on your back, which, let's be honest, are probably wildly inappropriate for the climate and social norms, and your modern, soft, easily shocked self. The sheer scale of the challenge hits you almost instantly. Everything requires effort. Simple things you take for granted, like clean water, warmth, or a locked door, are luxuries here. You quickly realize that the modern world has insulated you from the raw demands of nature and the brutal realities of human society in a way you never appreciated. It's like suddenly having to run a marathon after years of only walking to the fridge. Your mind races, trying to process the sheer otherness of it all. Where do you go? Who do you talk to? How do you even begin to navigate this world? The people around you are different. Their clothes are coarse, their faces weathered, their hands calloused. They move with a purpose born of necessity, not leisure. There's a constant undercurrent of tension, a wariness in their eyes that speaks volumes about the precariousness of their lives. You might try to ask for help, but your accent is strange, your mannerisms alien. They might just look at you blankly, or worse, with suspicion. In this era, strangers weren't always welcomed with open arms. They could be spies, vagrants, or worse. One mainstream historical fact that immediately becomes apparent is the sheer density of life in certain areas, despite the overall lower population compared to today. Villages and towns, though small by modern standards, were often incredibly crowded within their limits, leading to a constant proximity to others and their habits. There was little personal space as you understand it. Imagine living cheek by jowl with your neighbors, their animals, and all the accompanying sights and smells. It's an intimacy you're absolutely not prepared for. A quirky tidbit you might notice early on, if you're paying close attention, is the unexpected presence of certain animals in places you wouldn't expect. Pigs, for instance, were often allowed to roam relatively freely even within town limits, acting as informal garbage disposals. So, while you're trying to figure out which direction is north, you might have to dodge a foraging pig rooting around in what looks suspiciously like sewage. Charming! Historians still argue whether the concept of childhood existed in the medieval sense we understand it today, with its emphasis on play and protection. For many, especially in lower classes, life was a progression from being a burden to being a worker, with responsibilities starting at a very young age. This lack of a sheltered, extended childhood contributes to the hardened, pragmatic outlook you see in the faces around you. They haven't had the luxury of a slow transition into adulthood. Life's harsh lessons were learned early and brutally. Your soft hands, used to tapping on keyboards and scrolling through feeds, already feel out of place. The air isn't temperature controlled, the light isn't electric, and the only running water is probably a river you'd be very hesitant to drink from. Everything is manual, physical, and demanding. This isn't a simulation you can pause or quit. This is it. Your journey into the rough reality of medieval times has begun, and the sheer shock of it is the first hurdle. Can you even process this fundamental shift before the next, even more unpleasant, reality hits you? Probably not. But you have to try. Because there's no going back. And that next unpleasant reality hits you the moment you try to, well, just be. You might have spent the night huddled in a corner, or perhaps someone, taking pity on your bewildered state, pointed you towards a communal sleeping area. Wherever you are, the sensation of waking up is rough. Forget Egyptian cotton sheets and a memory foam mattress. You're likely lying on straw, maybe a thin wool blanket if you're lucky. The straw rustles and pokes, and you immediately feel the distinct, unwelcome sensation of something else moving around in it. Mice? Fleas? Probably both. The air is thick and stale, smelling of smoke from the central hearth, if there is one, damp earth, unwashed bodies, and maybe livestock if they share your dwelling, which, frankly, is pretty common. Your body aches. Not from a workout, but from the sheer unfamiliarity of sleeping on a hard, uneven surface in awkward positions. You try to stretch, and the coarse fabric of your borrowed or found clothing scrapes against your skin. This isn't your soft, broken-in t-shirt. This is wool or rough linen, likely stiff with dirt and sweat. Layers are key for warmth, but they're heavy and restrict movement. You might have a tunic, perhaps some leggings or hose tied with simple cords. Shoes, if you have them, are probably ill-fitting leather affairs, hard and unforgiving. The concept of comfortable, supportive footwear simply doesn't exist. Look around the dwelling you're in. If you're in a commoner's home, it's probably a simple structure, maybe 1 or 2 rooms. The walls are likely wattle and daub, woven branches plastered with a mix of clay, straw, and dung. The roof is thatch, providing decent insulation but also a haven for rodents and insects. Windows are small, often just unglazed openings that let in drafts and rain, or perhaps covered with animal hide or wooden shutters, plunging the interior into gloom even during the day. The floor is almost certainly packed earth, uneven and damp in places. There's no furniture as you know it, maybe a rough table, some stools or benches, and chests for storage. Everything is functional, crude, and bears the marks of constant use and repair. There's no privacy. Sleeping, eating, working, it often happens in the same space, with multiple family members, maybe even neighbors or hired hands, all living cheek by jowl. Imagine trying to find a moment to yourself when literally everyone you know is within arm's reach, and the walls offer no soundproofing whatsoever. Your modern need for personal space feels utterly bizarre and impossible here. You're never truly alone, which can be both a minor comfort in a dangerous world and an absolute nightmare for your introverted, boundary-respecting modern self. Getting dressed is less about choosing an outfit and more about simply putting on the same layers you wore yesterday, and the day before that, and likely the day before that too. Laundry day isn't a weekly ritual, it's an occasional, arduous task that involves beating clothes against rocks in a stream, assuming you even have access to clean water and the time for such a luxury. Consequently, your clothes are perpetually grubby, stiff, and carry a personal aroma that you are, unfortunately, becoming rapidly accustomed to. It's a smell that becomes a constant companion, a blend of body odor, smoke, and whatever other delightful substances you've brushed against throughout the day. Trying to explain the concept of fabric softener or antiperspirant to someone here would probably get you committed to the local asylum, if they had one. A mainstream historical fact about medieval housing for the vast majority of the population is its simplicity and multi-purpose nature. Homes were primarily shelters from the elements and places to sleep and eat, not distinct spaces for leisure or specific activities like we have today. The main room served as living area, kitchen, with the hearth, dining room, and bedroom. Even relatively prosperous peasants lived in small, crowded conditions compared to modern standards. A quirky tidbit you might observe is the state of the floor itself. Because earth floors were common, and cleaning as we know it was impossible, the floor often accumulated layers of rush, straw, reeds, or other plant material that were periodically added over refuse and dirt. Think of it as a primitive, organic carpet that was rarely fully replaced, leading to a fascinating ecosystem of crumbs, spills, and, well, whatever else ended up on the floor. It was basically a compost pile underfoot. Charming, right? Historians still argue whether the level of discomfort and lack of hygiene we perceive was genuinely felt as acutely by medieval people, who had no point of comparison to modern standards. Did they simply accept the smells, the dirt, the vermin as the normal state of existence, or was it a constant, low-grade misery? While we can't know exactly how it felt to them, from our perspective, the sheer physical unpleasantness of the living conditions, the clothing, and the constant lack of cleanliness is utterly overwhelming. You realize very quickly that your modern body, accustomed to daily showers, clean clothes, temperature control, and soft bedding, is staging a quiet, desperate protest. Your skin itches, your muscles ache, and the general feeling of being perpetually slightly damp and dirty is a constant, low-grade psychological drain. This isn't just a brief camping trip. This is life, every single day. And you've barely been here long enough for the sun to rise properly. Waking up uncomfortable and dirty is just the beginning of the physical gauntlet you're about to run. The physical discomfort of waking up on straw, feeling the grime on your skin and the stiffness of your clothes, is just the opening act. The real star of this particular medieval horror show is the smell. It hits you like a physical force, a dense, complex, and utterly overwhelming symphony of everything unpleasant. Forget the subtle background odors you might encounter today. This is a full frontal assault on your olfactory senses, a constant reminder of the brutal lack of sanitation and hygiene that permeates every single aspect of medieval life. The air itself feels heavy with it. Your nose, accustomed to filtered air, daily showers, and the discreet magic of modern plumbing, is utterly unprepared. The dominant notes are likely human and animal waste. Without organized sewage systems in most places, waste was often simply thrown into the streets, cesspits, or nearby waterways that also served as sources of drinking water. Yes, really. Imagine the smell of an overflowing porta-potty, but everywhere, all the time, baked in the sun or turned into a muddy, reeking slurry by rain. Add to that the constant presence of livestock, chickens, pigs, sheep, horses, often living in close proximity to humans, contributing their own unique bouquet to the atmosphere. But it's not just waste. There's the acrid smell of wood smoke from countless open hearths, often filling enclosed spaces and stinging your eyes. There's the greasy, heavy odor of cooking fats, often rancid. There's the sharp tang of tanning hides, a process that involves some truly foul-smelling chemicals and decaying animal matter. There's the metallic scent from the blacksmith. And underlying it all, the pervasive smell of unwashed bodies. Daily bathing was not a common practice, especially for the poor, and soap as we know it was rare and expensive. Clothes were worn for weeks or months without washing, accumulating layers of sweat, dirt, and whatever else they'd brushed against. Your own personal aroma, which you might have noticed starting to develop yesterday, is now just one note in this vast, malodorous chorus. It's like you've been marinating in a stew of everything gross for days. Trying to escape the smell is futile. Step outside? The streets are worse. Go inside a building? It likely smells of damp, smoke, and the accumulated history of its inhabitants. Even the countryside isn't immune. Manure is everywhere, and stagnant ponds breed their own particular brand of foulness. Your modern brain keeps trying to compartmentalize the smells, identify them, maybe even find a source to avoid. But here, they are simply the air you breathe. It's a constant, Low-grade assault that makes you feel perpetually slightly nauseous. That little air freshener you keep in your car? You need about 1 million of them here, and even then, they'd probably just mix with the existing smells to create something even more horrifying. The lack of hygiene wasn't just about personal preference, it had real consequences. The close proximity to waste, animals, and unwashed bodies, combined with contaminated water sources, created a breeding ground for disease. Flies are everywhere, drawn to the filth, landing on food, spreading pathogens. Rats and mice are common inhabitants of homes and public spaces, adding another layer of grime and potential disease vectors. The concept of germs was millennia away. People understood that certain things caused sickness, but they often attributed it to bad air, miasma, imbalance of humors, or divine displeasure, not microscopic organisms thriving in the very filth you are constantly surrounded by. A mainstream historical fact is that while Roman cities had complex aqueducts and sewage systems, much of that infrastructure fell into disrepair or was lost after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Medieval towns and cities, particularly in the early and high medieval periods, often lacked centralized waste disposal and clean water systems, leading to significant public health challenges. Waste management was largely individual or household-based, often involving dumping waste into streets, fields outside the town walls, or directly into rivers and streams. A quirky tidbit you might notice is that while cleanliness was not prioritized in the modern sense, people did use methods to try and mask or purify the air. Sweet-smelling herbs like lavender, mint, and rue were scattered on floors, mingled with that lovely floor rush, hung in homes, or carried on the person. Not just for pleasantness, but often because they believed these strong, pleasant smells could ward off the bad air, miasma, that they thought caused illness. It's a bit like trying to cover the smell of a landfill with a single scented candle. Admirable effort, utterly ineffective. Historians still argue whether medieval people were genuinely less sensitive to these pervasive smells due to constant exposure from birth, or if they simply endured them as an unavoidable part of life, perhaps experiencing a chronic, low-grade sensory assault that we can only imagine. Did they simply habituate to the stench, or was it a constant, unpleasant backdrop to their existence? While we can't know their internal experience, from our perspective, the sheer intensity and variety of the smells are utterly shocking and would likely be a significant source of stress and discomfort. Your modern nose would be in a state of perpetual rebellion. You might even find yourself holding your breath unconsciously, or developing a constant mild headache from the sheer olfactory overload. This isn't just an inconvenience, it's a constant, physical burden. And you've only just started smelling the roses, or rather, the refuse. So you're awake, uncomfortable, and perpetually assaulted by a symphony of smells that would make a modern sewage worker gag. Your stomach, bless its pampered, probiotic-filled heart, is probably starting to rumble. Right, food. Another basic necessity, right? How hard can that be? Well, settle in, because medieval mealtimes are less about culinary delight and more about caloric survival, often involving dishes that would send your taste buds screaming for mercy and your digestive system into full revolt. Forget the convenience store down the street, the endless aisles of the supermarket, or the simple act of ordering in. Obtaining, preparing, and consuming food in this era is a fundamental challenge, fraught with monotony and peril. Your first meal, whenever and however you manage to procure it, is unlikely to be a feast. For the vast majority of people, the diet was incredibly limited and heavily reliant on grains. Think less artisanal bread and more hard, dense loaves made from rye or barley, often mixed with other fillers like peas or beans, and sometimes even ground acorns or sawdust in times of scarcity. This wasn't just toast, this was the foundation of almost every meal. You'd likely chew on this tough bread, probably stale, and wash it down with, well, we'll get to the drinks later, but let's just say clean water wasn't the go-to. The other staple was pottage. This was basically a thick stew or porridge made by boiling grains, like oats, barley, or millet, vegetables, like cabbage, leeks, onions, or peas, that were available seasonally, and maybe, if you were lucky, a tiny scrap of meat or fat for flavor. It was cooked in a single pot over the open fire, often simmering for hours or even days, with new ingredients added as they became available. The consistency could vary from thin gruel to something you could stand a spoon up in. It was nutritious, filling, and utterly, soul-crushingly monotonous. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner could very well be variations on the same pottage, day in and day out. Your concept of eating the rainbow is utterly alien here. You're lucky if you'd get more than 3 shades of beige and green. Food preparation itself was primitive. No gas stoves, no electric ovens, no microwaves. Everything was cooked over an open hearth, requiring constant attention to prevent burning or uneven cooking. Utensils were basic: wooden spoons, simple knives, maybe a cauldron or two. Hygiene during preparation was minimal, to put it mildly. Hands weren't washed regularly, ingredients weren't necessarily cleaned thoroughly, and that pervasive smell we talked about. Yeah, it's in the air, settling on everything. Plus, remember those flies drawn to the filth? They're very interested in your pottage. And then there's the constant threat of spoilage and contamination. There was no refrigeration. Food preservation relied on salting, smoking, drying, or pickling, methods that weren't always effective, especially in fluctuating temperatures. Meat could go bad quickly, grains could be infested with weevils or mold, and vegetables would rot. Eating spoiled food wasn't just unpleasant, it was a direct path to violent illness, and potentially death. You quickly learned to inspect your food very carefully, though without understanding bacteria or pathogens, you're mostly relying on smell and sight, which, given the overall olfactory environment, might not be the most reliable indicators. That funky smell might just be the normal smell of fermented cabbage, or it might be the smell of impending doom for your digestive system. It's a gamble every time you lift the spoon. Variety was a luxury dictated by the seasons and your social standing. If you were a peasant, your diet was almost entirely plant-based, supplemented by occasional eggs from your chickens or milk from your cow, if you had them. Meat was rare, often only eaten on feast days or when an animal had to be slaughtered. Fish was more common, especially near rivers or the coast, and particularly important on the many fasting days dictated by the church when meat was forbidden. For the wealthy, the diet was richer: more meat, poultry, fish, spices, imported at great cost, and fine bread. But even for them, variety was limited compared to modern standards, and preservation issues were still a concern. Trying to find your favorite snack food here is like trying to find a unicorn riding a bicycle, utterly impossible. Your concept of a balanced diet and hitting your macros? Hilarious. A mainstream historical fact about the medieval diet is its heavy reliance on grains, which constituted the vast majority of the calories consumed by the poor. Bread, in various forms, was the cornerstone of almost every meal, often accounting for 70 to 80% of a person's daily intake. Meat was much less common than is often depicted in popular culture, particularly for the peasantry, who might only eat it a few times a year. A quirky tidbit about medieval eating habits is the common practice of using trenchers. Instead of plates, stale bread loaves, often several days old, were sometimes hollowed out or cut into thick slices to serve as edible platters. Food would be placed directly onto the trencher, and after the meal, the trencher itself would be eaten, if you were hungry enough, or given to the poor or the dogs. So, your plate wasn't just something you washed, it was part of the meal, adding a whole new meaning to cleaning your plate. Historians still argue whether the medieval diet, particularly for the working classes, provided sufficient nutrition despite its monotony. While lacking in certain vitamins and fresh produce during parts of the year, the grain-heavy diet provided substantial calories and fiber. Some argue that common diseases like scurvy were less prevalent than might be expected, suggesting some level of nutritional adequacy, while others point to evidence of widespread malnutrition and stunted growth in skeletal remains. Was it just enough to get by, or was it a constant state of low-level deficiency? The simple act of eating becomes a reminder of your precarious position. Every mouthful carries a risk, every meal highlights the narrowness of your options. You quickly stop being a picky eater. Hunger is a powerful motivator, and the fear of starvation outweighs the blandness or the faint, unsettling smell coming from the bottom of the pottage pot. your modern palate, used to complex flavors, diverse textures, and guaranteed safety, is utterly overwhelmed by the sheer sameness and the underlying anxiety that comes with every bite. You wouldn't last long on your culinary preferences alone, that's for sure. And you've barely finished breakfast. Okay, so you've survived waking up in a pile of straw and grime, navigated the olfactory minefield that is medieval air, and managed to choke down some questionable pottage without immediately throwing up. Congratulations. You've cleared the first few hurdles. But what happens when your modern body inevitably decides it's had enough of this nonsense? Maybe that funky bread didn't agree with you, or perhaps one of those ever-present flies decided to take a dip in your stew and left something behind. Or maybe you just tripped over a pig and broke your ankle. Whatever the cause, you're sick or injured, and now you get to experience the truly terrifying reality of medieval medicine. Your first thought is probably, "Okay, I need a doctor. Where's the nearest hospital?" And that's where the cold, hard dread really sets in. Forget sterile environments, diagnostic tests, or pain relief beyond maybe a stiff drink. Medieval medicine is a world away from the comforting presence of antiseptics and antibiotics. The understanding of the human body was rudimentary at best. Illness was often attributed to an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, or perhaps the influence of stars, witchcraft, or, most terrifyingly, divine punishment for your sins. So, your treatment might be less about targeting a specific pathogen and more about rebalancing your internal fluids or making peace with God. Good luck explaining the concept of a bacterial infection to someone who thinks your fever is caused by an excess of yellow bile. The most common treatment for almost anything? Bloodletting. Feeling weak? Let some blood. Have a headache? Let some blood. Broken leg? Let some blood. The idea was that removing blood would drain the excess humor causing the problem. This was performed by barbers, who also did minor surgery, haircut, and dentistry. Talk about a multitasker, using lances or, perhaps most famously, leeches. Yes, you might find yourself with a few slimy, blood-sucking invertebrates attached to your skin as the preferred method of treatment. Try not to scream. They probably think it's helping. Your modern aversion to blood and needles is about to get a serious workout. Surgery, when performed, was a brutal, horrifying affair. There was no effective anesthesia as we know it. Maybe some opium or alcohol to dull the senses slightly, but you were largely awake and aware while someone poked, prodded, and cut into you. Imagine having a limb amputated with a rusty saw, or a tooth pulled with pliers, with nothing but a leather strap to bite down on. The risk of infection afterward was astronomical, given the lack of sterile instruments or understanding of how disease spread. A simple cut could turn deadly. Even something like setting a broken bone was incredibly painful and often resulted in permanent disfigurement or disability if not done correctly. You'll probably decide that whatever minor ailment you have, you'd rather just tough it out than go anywhere near a medieval doctor. Beyond bloodletting and basic surgery, treatments often involved herbal remedies, poultices, and concoctions that ranged from mildly effective to utterly bizarre and potentially dangerous. Some herbs did have medicinal properties, but dosages were imprecise, and they were often mixed with other ingredients based on superstition or tradition rather than scientific understanding. You might be given a potion made from ground-up stones, animal dung, or other substances that would make your stomach turn even when you weren't already sick. Remember that pervasive smell? Imagine trying to swallow something that smells even worse, prescribed as medicine. If you were lucky enough to live near a monastery, monks sometimes had access to ancient medical texts and cultivated medicinal gardens, offering slightly more informed, though still primitive, care. Wealthy individuals might be able to afford a physician, often trained in universities that were beginning to emerge. But even these learned men still largely adhered to the humoral theory and lacked fundamental knowledge of anatomy or germ theory. For the vast majority of the population, medical care was limited to folk remedies, the local wise woman or barber surgeon, and a whole lot of prayer. A mainstream historical fact about medieval medicine is that despite the often primitive practices, universities in places like Salerno, Montpellier, and Paris began to teach medicine based on rediscovered classical texts, like those of Hippocrates and Galen, and Arab medical knowledge, laying some groundwork for future medical advancements. Although these learned approaches often remain separate from the folk medicine practiced by most people. A quirky tidbit you might encounter is the widespread use of urine as a diagnostic tool. Physicians would examine the color, smell, and even taste of a patient's urine, yes, taste, to determine the imbalance of humors and diagnose illness. They even had elaborate charts detailing what different colors and properties of urine indicated. So, next time you're feeling under the weather, be prepared to provide a sample for intense scrutiny, and potentially a sip test. Cheers! Historians still argue whether medieval medical practices, particularly herbal remedies and practices like bone setting by skilled practitioners, were more effective than we give them credit for, providing genuine relief or even cures in some cases, or if their perceived success was largely due to the placebo effect, the body's own healing capabilities, or simply luck in a world where many ailments resolved on their own or killed quickly regardless of treatment. Your modern knowledge of hygiene and basic first aid would be revolutionary, but also likely dismissed as madness or witchcraft. Trying to explain the importance of washing hands before surgery, or that tiny invisible creatures cause disease, would be met with blank stares or outright hostility. You are utterly powerless against the medical realities of this era. A simple cold could turn into pneumonia, a minor cut into a fatal infection. The constant threat of illness, combined with the terrifying prospects of treatment, adds yet another thick layer of anxiety to your already burdened existence. You quickly realize that in medieval times, getting sick is less an inconvenience and more a potential death sentence, and the people trying to help you might actually make things worse. Okay, so you're terrified of falling ill, and you're probably realizing that even a paper cut feels like a life-threatening injury in this era. But let's say, for the moment, you manage to avoid the plague, the flux, and the barber's blade. You still have to live. And in medieval times, living isn't a passive activity, it's an endless cycle of relentless, backbreaking labor. Your modern life, with its climate-controlled offices, ergonomic chairs, and handy delivery services, has utterly failed to prepare you for the sheer, unadulterated physical grind that defines existence here. Forget your gym membership, or your weekend warrior hobbies. This is a full-contact sport where the only prize is survival. For the vast majority of people, life revolves around the land. If you're in the countryside, you are almost certainly an agricultural laborer, bound by tradition, law, or sheer necessity to work the fields. This isn't like pottering in a garden. This is wrestling a living from the earth with tools that look like they belong in a museum, because they do. Plowing is done with oxen or horses pulling a heavy wooden plow that barely scratches the surface of the soil, requiring immense strength just to guide it straight. Sowing seeds is a manual process, walking back and forth, hoping the birds don't eat them all. Weeding is done by hand, bent over for hours under the sun or in the damp mud. Harvesting is an absolute marathon of physical exertion. Reaping grain involves swinging a sickle or scythe for days on end, cutting stalks one by one, or in small handfuls. Then comes binding the sheaves, carrying them, threshing the grain, beating it with flails to separate the kernels from the husks, incredibly dusty, tiring work, and winnowing it, tossing it in the air to let the wind blow away the chaff. Every single step is manual, repetitive, and exhausting. Your muscles, used to typing emails or lifting weights in a controlled environment, would scream in protest within hours. The calluses would form blisters, the blisters would burst, and the dirt would get into everything, leading back to those lovely medieval medical issues we just discussed. It's a vicious cycle. And it's not just farming. Even if you're in a town, physical labor is the norm. Craftspeople work long hours, often in cramped, poorly lit conditions, using hand tools that require significant strength and dexterity. Blacksmiths hammer hot metal, carpenters saw and plane wood, masons haul heavy stones. Domestic work is equally demanding, fetching water from the well or river. Remember how clean that water was? Yeah, you still have to carry it, chopping wood for fuel, grinding grain by hand using a quernstone, a truly mind-numbing, arm-aching task, washing clothes by beating them against rocks, cooking over an open fire that fills the room with smoke. There are no washing machines, no central heating, no electric kettles, no cars, no bikes even for most people. Everything you need, you either make, grow, or carry yourself. The pace of life is dictated by the seasons and the sun. Work starts at dawn and finishes at dusk, with short breaks for meager meals. There's no concept of a 40-hour work week or paid overtime. You work as long as there is light and work to be done. During peak seasons like harvest, the labor is intense and non-stop. During winter, work might slow down, but there are still animals to care for, tools to repair, and the constant need to keep warm and fed. There's very little leisure time, and when it exists, it's often tied to religious festivals or involves activities that still require physical effort, like dancing or rough sports. Your idea of unwinding with a streaming service and a snack? Utterly foreign. Your body is your primary tool, and it is expected to perform constantly, without complaint. There's no sick leave, no disability benefits, no retirement plan. If you can't work, you don't eat. It's that simple, that brutal. Children start contributing to labor from a very young age, doing chores, helping in the fields, or learning a craft. The concept of a protected, work-free childhood is a modern invention. You'd be expected to pull your weight almost immediately, regardless of your previous experience, which is, let's face it, zero when it comes to manual labor. You'd be the weakest, slowest, most incompetent person around, constantly struggling to keep up. A mainstream historical fact about medieval labor is that the vast majority of the population, estimated at over 80 to 90% in many regions, was engaged in agriculture. Their lives and work cycles were directly tied to the rhythms of planting, growing, and harvesting crops, and their economic status was largely determined by the success of their harvests and the obligations they owed to their lord. A quirky tidbit you might find fascinating, or horrifying, is the medieval practice of gleaning. After the harvest was officially completed by the lord or farmer, poorer members of the community, particularly women and children, were often allowed to go through the fields and pick up any leftover stalks or grain that had been missed. It was backbreaking work for minimal reward, but it could make the difference between starvation and survival for the very poorest families. Imagine spending days bent double, sifting through stubble just to gather a few handfuls of grain. Historians still argue whether the average medieval peasant worked fewer or more hours per year compared to their modern counterparts. While medieval people worked incredibly long hours during peak agricultural seasons, they also had numerous religious holidays, feast days, and periods of enforced idleness during winter or bad weather. Some scholars suggest that when averaged across the year, the total hours worked might have been comparable to or even less than modern full-time employment, though the intensity and physicality of the work were undeniably much higher. Your modern body, accustomed to convenience and comfort, would likely break down under the strain within days. The constant physical exertion, combined with the poor diet, lack of hygiene, and exposure to the elements, would lead to chronic aches, pains, and injuries. You'd develop muscles you didn't know you had, but you'd also develop arthritis, back problems, and worn-out joints at a relatively young age. The simple act of getting through the day would feel like an epic struggle. And this isn't just for a week or two, this is your life, every single day, until you're too old or too broken to continue. You wouldn't last long before the sheer physical toll caught up with you. Okay, so you're physically broken from a day spent wrestling with a primitive plow or hauling water buckets, your stomach is grumbling from another bowl of beige pottage, and your nose is staging a full-scale rebellion against the local aroma. You're exhausted, uncomfortable, and constantly slightly nauseous. Surely, at least, you can feel safe? Lock your door, maybe set up a little Ring camera? Oh, my sweet, naive modern friend. Safety in medieval times isn't a right, it's a constant, daily gamble you're almost certainly going to lose. Your concept of personal security, built on police forces, locked doors, and streetlights, is about as useful here as a smartphone with no signal, which, incidentally, you also don't have. The threats are everywhere, and they are much more immediate and brutal than checking your bank account balance or worrying about porch pirates. Within your own community, while neighbors might offer some mutual protection, petty crime is rampant. Hunger is a powerful motivator, and theft is a common response to desperation. Leaving anything valuable unsecured is an open invitation. A stray chicken, a few vegetables from your patch, a tool left carelessly, all are fair game. And without a formal police force, justice for such crimes is often rough and ready, or depends entirely on the whim of whoever holds local authority. Reporting a theft isn't like calling 911. It might involve begging your lord's bailiff to care, or perhaps taking matters into your own hands, leading to escalating feuds and violence. Stepping outside the immediate confines of your village or town significantly ratchets up the danger level. Remember how we talked about travel being slow and miserable? Well, it's also incredibly risky. Roads, such as they were often poorly maintained, isolated, and perfect ambush spots for bandits and outlaws. These weren't just petty thieves. These were often desperate men, and sometimes women, who had fallen outside the law, perhaps soldiers from disbanded armies, peasants driven from their land, or simply career criminals. They operated in gangs, preying on travelers, merchants, and anyone foolish enough to journey alone or with insufficient protection. Being robbed wasn't just losing your meager possessions, it could mean being beaten, injured, or even killed. The fear of encountering such individuals was a very real deterrent to moving around, keeping people tied to their local areas. Imagine the anxiety of a simple trip to the next village market, knowing that every stretch of woods or isolated hill could hide a potentially deadly threat. Your modern fear of a dark alley has nothing on the pervasive dread of traveling medieval roads. But even if you avoid the common criminal and the roadside bandit, you are still subject to the whims of the feudal justice system, which is, to put it mildly, terrifyingly arbitrary and often brutal. There's no presumption of innocence, no right to a lawyer, what's a lawyer, and certainly no appeal process as you understand it. Justice is dispensed by the local lord, his representatives, or sometimes communal courts, often based on custom, personal bias, or who could pay the biggest bribe. The lines between enforcing order and simply exerting power were constantly blurred. Your fate could depend less on the facts of a case and more on your social standing, your relationship with the Lord, or even his mood that day. Punishments were swift, public, and often horrific, designed to deter others through fear. For minor offenses like petty theft or public drunkenness, you might be put in the stocks or the pillory, left exposed to public ridicule, rotten vegetables, and worse. Imagine being stuck there for hours, unable to defend yourself from a hostile crowd. More serious crimes could result in mutilation, hands cut off for repeated theft, ears cropped, noses slit. The idea wasn't just punishment, it was marking you, identifying you as a criminal for life. And for serious offenses, or even relatively minor ones depending on the Lord's temper, the punishment was death. Hanging was common, often carried out publicly as a grim spectacle. There were no lengthy court proceedings, no juries of your peers in the modern sense, though communal courts existed, they operated differently, and certainly no appeals based on technicalities. If you were accused and deemed guilty, your life could be forfeit on the spot. Trying to explain the concept of due process would likely get you a confused stare, followed by an even swifter judgment. You want process? Here's a rope. A mainstream historical fact about medieval justice is its fragmented and localized nature. There was no single, overarching legal system enforced by a central state across an entire kingdom for most of the period. Instead, justice was administered through a complex web of overlapping jurisdictions, manorial courts run by lords for peasants, town courts for burgesses, church courts for clergy and moral offenses, and royal courts that dealt with more serious crimes and gradually expanded their influence over time. This meant the law could vary significantly from one place to another, and your rights, or lack thereof, depended heavily on where you lived and who your lord was. A quirky tidbit you might find unsettling is the medieval practice of trial by ordeal. If evidence was unclear or conflicting, a person's guilt or innocence might be determined by subjecting them to a dangerous or painful test, with the outcome interpreted as divine judgment. This could involve holding a hot iron, plunging your arm into boiling water, or being thrown into a body of water. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty. a bit of a catch-22. The idea was that God would intervene to protect the innocent. While the Church eventually condemned some forms of ordeal, they highlight just how far removed medieval notions of justice were from modern rational inquiry and evidence-based trials. Fancy your chances with a dip in the river to prove you didn't steal that loaf of bread? Didn't think so. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of violent crime was higher in the Middle Ages compared to today, adjusting for population size. While the justice system was brutal and public, and interpersonal violence was perhaps more normalized, particularly among certain social groups, some scholars suggest that the strong community ties and the very harshness of the punishments might have acted as significant deterrents to certain types of crime. While others point to archaeological evidence of widespread trauma and historical records detailing frequent outbreaks of violence and lawlessness. Was medieval society inherently more violent, or was its violence simply less controlled and more visible? Your modern sense of personal security would be shattered almost immediately. You couldn't walk alone at night, you couldn't leave your possessions unattended, and you couldn't trust that you would receive fair treatment if accused of something. The constant awareness of potential threats, combined with the terrifying nature of the justice system, would create a pervasive sense of anxiety and vulnerability. You'd quickly learn to be wary of strangers, to keep your head down, and to rely solely on the immediate few people you might be able to trust, which, as a newcomer, is probably nobody. You wouldn't last long feeling safe, because you wouldn't be safe, not by a long shot. So you've made it through the night, dodged the local ruffians, and somehow avoided being sentenced to the stocks for looking suspicious. You're still aching, still perpetually itchy and smelly, and the thought of another bowl of pottage makes your questionable medieval stomach churn. Maybe, just maybe, you think, there's a better life somewhere else. The next town over? A different village? You decide you need to move. And that, my friends, is where you encounter the next layer of medieval misery: travel. Your modern brain pictures a quick drive, maybe a train ride, a plane if it's far. Ah, bless your optimistic, geographically mobile heart. Medieval travel is slow, dangerous, and utterly, soul-crushingly miserable. Step outside your immediate community, and the world expands, but it doesn't get easier. The concept of well-maintained, paved roads connecting places is largely a distant memory from the Roman era, or perhaps something only the highest nobility occasionally benefits from. For the most part, roads are little more than dirt tracks, rutted by cart wheels, churned into impassable mud by rain, or dusty and cracked in the heat. They wind unpredictably, often following ancient paths or the contours of the land rather than taking the most direct route. And they are not signposted. Forget helpful little brown signs telling you the distance to the next town or pointing you towards local attractions, like the public execution grounds, perhaps? You're relying on vague directions, the sun, and the hope that you don't take a wrong turn and end up in a bog or a forest known for harboring wolves. It's like trying to navigate using Google Maps from 1995, except the map is drawn on a piece of bark and half the landmarks have disappeared. How do you travel? Well, unless you're incredibly wealthy, you're walking. Miles upon miles, day after day. Your ill-fitting, hard leather shoes, if you even have them, are going to make your feet ache in ways you didn't know were possible. Every pebble feels like a boulder, every incline a mountain. And you're not walking on a nice, smooth sidewalk. You're navigating uneven terrain, splashing through puddles, dodging animal droppings, and constantly watching your step lest you twist an ankle, which, given the state of medieval medicine, is basically a game-over scenario. A trip that would take you an hour by car might take you 2 or 3 days on foot. Just getting to the next town could be an epic journey. If you're slightly better off, maybe you can afford a horse, or a place on a cart. But horses are expensive to buy and maintain, and carts are slow, bumpy, and still subject to the terrible roads. Riding a horse for long distances without proper training and equipment is also incredibly tiring, both for you and the animal. And if the cart breaks down, which, given the state of manufacture, is a distinct possibility, you're stranded. There's no AAA in the Middle Ages, folks. You're either fixing it yourself with whatever you can find, or you're hoping someone comes along eventually who can help. And the misery isn't just the slowness or the physical strain. It's the lack of amenities. There are no convenient rest stops with clean bathrooms and vending machines selling questionable hot dogs. Inns exist, particularly along major routes, but they are often basic, crowded, and expensive. You might share a room, or even a bed, with complete strangers, and the hygiene levels are, well, you know by now. If you can't afford an inn, you're sleeping rough. Under a tree, in a barn if you're lucky enough to find one whose owner doesn't chase you off, or just by the side of the road, exposed to the elements, and whatever creatures might be lurking in the dark. Remember the discomfort of waking up in your own dwelling? Imagine that, but outside, maybe wet, maybe freezing, with bugs crawling all over you. Beyond the discomfort, there's the ever-present danger. We touched on bandits in the last section, but they are a primary concern when traveling. Isolated stretches of road, forests, and hills are their hunting grounds. Traveling alone is incredibly risky. Merchants and wealthier individuals often traveled in groups or hired armed guards, but even then, ambushes were common. For a lone, clearly out-of-place individual like yourself, you'd be a prime target. Your modern clothes, if you still had them, would scream, "Stranger with potentially interesting things." Even if those things were just your car keys and a crumpled receipt for a latte. Any meager possessions you had would be forfeit, and as discussed, the violence accompanying robbery could be severe. Natural dangers are also amplified. Getting lost means potentially starving or freezing before you find your way. Rivers might need to be forded, and without bridges or boats, this could be treacherous, especially after rain. Wild animals, while perhaps not as prevalent as in true wilderness areas, were still a threat, particularly wolves or wild boar, especially if you were sleeping outdoors. The lack of communication is also terrifying. If you get into trouble, there's no phone to call for help. You are entirely reliant on yourself and the slim chance that someone else happens to come along. A mainstream historical fact about medieval travel is that while major Roman roads fell into disrepair, some routes were maintained, and new ones developed, often focused on connecting important towns, monasteries, and castles. However, the quality varied immensely, and long-distance travel remained difficult and expensive for most people, primarily undertaken for necessary reasons like trade, pilgrimage, or military service, rather than leisure. A quirky tidbit related to travel is the practice of thotale, or journey money, given to travelers, particularly pilgrims, by monasteries or wealthy individuals to help them on their way. It wasn't much, often just enough for a few basic meals or a night's shelter, but it highlights the recognition that travel was a significant undertaking requiring financial support, not something you just did on a whim with your debit card. Historians still argue whether the dangers of medieval travel, particularly from bandits, were as widespread and constant as popular imagination often portrays, or if they were more localized and seasonal threats, exaggerated in tales and ballads. While records certainly show instances of robbery and violence on the roads, the frequency and organized nature of banditry across entire regions is a subject of ongoing debate. Your modern expectation of a smooth, safe, and relatively quick journey would be utterly crushed. Every mile would be a physical struggle, every night a test of endurance and courage, and every turn of the road a potential encounter with danger. The sheer effort required to move from one place to another would make you think twice about ever leaving your immediate vicinity. You wouldn't last long on the open road before the physical toll, the lack of comfort, or the very real threat of violence caught up with you. The world outside your village isn't an escape, it's just a different, equally brutal arena. So you've survived the perilous journey, perhaps limping into a new village, exhausted, dusty, and even more desperately in need of a bath than before, if that were even possible. You might think, okay, new place, new start. Maybe things will be better here. And then you meet the local lord, or his representative, and the harsh reality of medieval society slams into you like a rusty portcullis. Your modern belief in equality, individual rights, and the possibility of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Utterly meaningless here. You've just run headfirst into the rigid, inescapable wall of the medieval social hierarchy. This isn't a society where you get to choose your path or climb the career ladder based on merit. For the vast, overwhelming majority of people, your place in the world is determined by one simple, immutable fact: who your parents were. You are born into a class, and for all intents and purposes, that is where you stay. The structure is often described as a pyramid, or perhaps more accurately, a series of layers stacked on top of each other, with very little permeability between them. At the very top is the monarch, ruling by divine right. Below them are the high nobility, dukes, counts, barons, who hold vast lands and wield immense power, often acting like mini-kings in their own territories. Then come the lower nobility, knights and minor lords, who serve the higher lords, usually in exchange for land or income. Below them is the clergy, a separate but powerful group ranging from bishops and abbots, often from noble families, down to parish priests and monks. And at the very bottom, the broad base of the pyramid, are the commoners, the peasants, serfs, and townspeople. This is where you belong. Welcome to the bottom. As a commoner, particularly in the countryside, you are most likely a peasant, and quite possibly a serf. What does that mean for your bright future? It means you are tied to the land. You don't own it, the Lord does. You work his land, the domain, for a certain number of days a week as part of your obligations, and in exchange, you are allowed to work a small plot of land for yourself and your family. But even the produce from your own plot isn't entirely yours. You owe the Lord a portion of your harvest, along with various other taxes and dues. You might owe him a certain number of chickens, a portion of your grain, or even service in repairing his castle or roads. It's like a perpetual, involuntary subscription service where the cost keeps going up and the benefits are questionable. Being a serf is even worse. Serfs were legally bound to the manor and the lord. They couldn't leave without the lord's permission. They often needed his permission to marry, especially if they wanted to marry someone from another manor. If the lord sold the manor, the serfs went with it, like furniture. You weren't exactly a slave, but your freedom was incredibly restricted. Your entire life, from birth to death, was lived within the confines of the manor, under the authority of the lord. Imagine needing permission from your landlord to get married or move cities. It's a level of control that is utterly alien to the modern mind. Even if you were a free peasant or lived in a town as a merchant or craftsman, you were still subject to the authority of the local lord or the town council, which was usually dominated by wealthy merchants or guilds. Your rights were limited, your ability to challenge authority was minimal, and your social standing was fixed. There were no public schools offering free education to help you improve your prospects, no scholarships to university, no bank loans to start a business, unless you were already wealthy. Your children would almost certainly follow in your footsteps, performing the same backbreaking labor, living under the same restrictions. The idea of social mobility as a widespread phenomenon simply didn't exist. You were born a peasant, you would die a peasant. End of story. Trying to navigate this system with your modern sensibilities would be incredibly frustrating and likely dangerous. You'd question authority, demand fair treatment, and express opinions that would be considered insolence, if not outright rebellion. In a society where deference to your social betters was expected and enforced, speaking your mind could easily land you in serious trouble with the lord or his bailiff. Your modern concept of customer service or employee rights would be met with laughter, followed by punishment. The lord is not interested in your complaints about working conditions or your suggestions for improving crop yields. He is interested in his dues and your obedience. It's a power dynamic based on inherited status and physical force, not negotiation or legal rights. A mainstream historical fact about the medieval social structure is the concept of the three orders: those who fight, the nobility; those who pray, the clergy; and those who work, the commoners. While this model simplified reality and didn't fully account for the complexities of urban life or variations within each group, it reflects the dominant societal understanding of the time that society was divinely ordained and structured into distinct, largely hereditary functional groups. A quirky tidbit you might find surprising is the existence of sumptuary laws in some medieval periods and places. These laws dictated what certain social classes were allowed to wear, consume, or display. For example, certain colors of fabric, types of fur, or elaborate styles of clothing might be restricted to the nobility, making it legally impossible for a commoner to dress above their station. Imagine being fined or punished just for wearing a particular shade of purple. It was a way to visibly reinforce the social hierarchy and prevent commoners from blurring the lines of status, which, let's be honest, you'd probably do accidentally on day one just by wearing your modern clothes. Historians still argue whether the medieval social hierarchy was as completely rigid and static as the traditional model suggests, or if there were more avenues for social mobility, particularly in growing towns, through successful trade, joining a guild, or entering the clergy. While acknowledging that large-scale upward mobility was rare for the peasantry, some scholars point to examples of individuals or families who managed to improve their status over generations, suggesting a system that, while highly restrictive, wasn't entirely impenetrable. Your modern sense of individual agency and opportunity would be utterly stifled by this system. You couldn't just decide to become a blacksmith if you were born a farmer's son, unless you were apprenticed and accepted into the guild, a difficult and often costly process, and even then, you'd still be firmly within the commoner class. Your dreams and ambitions would be curtailed by the circumstances of your birth. The sheer psychological weight of knowing that your future, and the future of your potential children, is largely predetermined by your social standing would be incredibly demoralizing. You wouldn't last long before the lack of freedom and opportunity crushed your modern spirit. So you've just had your hopes and dreams neatly filed away under impossible in this lifetime by the medieval social structure, and you're settling into the crushing reality of your predetermined place at the bottom. You're tired, hungry, smelly, and keenly aware that your personal safety is a joke. But just when you thought life couldn't get any more unpredictable, you remember another little detail about this era: peace is the exception, not the rule. Warfare isn't something you read about in history books or see on the news far away. It's a constant, looming shadow, always potentially just over the horizon, ready to spill into your already precarious existence. Your modern notion of national borders and professional standing armies feels quaintly optimistic here. Conflict in the Middle Ages was endemic. Lords squabbled over land, kings fought for power, regions raided their neighbors, and religious differences could ignite brutal wars. Even if you weren't directly involved as a soldier, the effects of warfare rippled outwards, impacting everyone. Imagine living in a world where the next village could suddenly become hostile territory, or where a lord's political maneuverings hundreds of miles away could result in an army marching through your fields, demanding food, shelter, or worse. There was no Geneva Convention, no rules of engagement designed to protect civilians. When armies moved, they lived off the land, often plundering, burning, and causing widespread destruction to anyone unlucky enough to be in their path. Your little cottage, your meager crops, your few precious possessions, they could all be gone in a flash, trampled or looted by soldiers who saw you as little more than an obstacle or a resource. And the warfare itself was brutal. Forget clean, surgical strikes. Medieval battles were often chaotic, bloody affairs fought hand-to-hand with weapons designed for maximum damage against unarmored or lightly armored bodies. Swords, axes, spears, maces, they were heavy, sharp, and swung with deadly intent. Arrows rained down from bows, including the fearsome longbow, capable of piercing armor at close range. Cavalry charges were terrifying forces, horses and riders crashing into infantry lines. Sieges of castles and towns were long, drawn-out affairs involving starvation, disease, and the use of massive, destructive machines like trebuchets hurling rocks or even disease-ridden carcasses over walls. Imagine the psychological terror of living in a besieged town, knowing that if the walls fall, the soldiers outside might show no mercy. You, as a commoner, are highly unlikely to be a knight, those heavily armored, mounted warriors who dominated the battlefield for centuries. Becoming a knight required immense wealth, training, and noble birth, 3 things you absolutely do not possess. You might, however, be pressed into service as infantry, particularly if your lord needs manpower. This means being given a spear or a simple bow, maybe a padded jacket for protection if you're lucky, and being told to stand in a line and face a charging enemy. Your modern aversion to anything more physically demanding than carrying groceries would make you spectacularly ill-suited for the sheer terror and violence of medieval combat. The training is minimal, the equipment is basic, and the likelihood of survival is not great. You'd probably trip over your own feet trying to run away, only to be unceremoniously speared by someone who's been doing this since they were a teenager. Even if you weren't directly involved in the fighting, the threat was constant. Rumors of approaching armies would spread panic. Able-bodied men might be conscripted, leaving families without crucial labor. Trade routes could be disrupted, leading to shortages and even famine. The physical landscape itself bore the scars of conflict: ruined castles, burned-out villages, fields left fallow because the population had been scattered or killed. Living in medieval times meant living with a constant, low-grade anxiety that at any moment, the relative stability of your life could be shattered by the arrival of armed men. Building anything substantial, investing in your future, felt like a gamble when it could all be destroyed tomorrow by a passing army. It's like living in a neighborhood with perpetual, unpredictable flash floods, except the floodwaters are angry people with swords. A mainstream historical fact about medieval warfare is the rise of the knight as the dominant military figure, particularly from the 11th to 13th centuries. Mounted, armored warriors, often bound by codes of chivalry, though the reality could be far less romantic, were central to the armies of feudal lords and kings, symbolizing military power and social status. Their decline began with the increasing effectiveness of massed infantry, particularly those armed with longbows or pikes, and later, gunpowder weapons. A quirky tidbit you might find oddly fascinating, or just gross, is the medieval use of psychological warfare and biological agents during sieges. As mentioned, besiegers might catapult dead animals or even plague victims over the walls of a besieged town or castle to spread disease and terror among the defenders. It's a grim reminder that medieval conflict wasn't just about pitched battles. It was about breaking the enemy's will through any means available, including weaponizing decay and illness. Talk about adding insult to injury, and then adding infection. Historians still argue whether the frequency and scale of warfare in the Middle Ages were significantly higher than in other historical periods, or if the localized nature and limited scope of many conflicts, compared to modern total wars, mean the overall impact on the population was perhaps less devastating than often portrayed, despite the undeniable brutality of individual battles and raids. Was it constant low-level conflict, or periods of intense violence interspersed with relative peace? The constant threat of warfare adds another layer of stress to your already overwhelming existence. You couldn't just live your life assuming peace would last. You had to be prepared, or at least aware, that everything could change overnight if a lord decided to raise an army, or a neighboring territory launched a raid. Your inability to fight, your lack of protection, and your position at the bottom of the social ladder make you incredibly vulnerable to the unpredictable tides of medieval conflict. You wouldn't last long before you were either caught up in the violence directly or suffered the devastating consequences of war passing through your land. The drums of war are always beating, faintly or loudly, in the background of medieval life. So you're living under the constant shadow of war, the threat of violence is always there, and your modern comfort levels have been thoroughly obliterated. You're aching, dirty, hungry, and scared. In times of such overwhelming uncertainty and hardship, where do people turn for solace, meaning, or control? In the medieval world, the answer is simple, absolute, and permeates every single aspect of your existence: religion. Specifically, the Christian Church, in Western Europe at least, isn't just a part of life, it is life. Your modern concept of separating church and state, or religion being a personal choice, is laughably out of place here. The church is the state, the law, the social glue, and the ultimate arbiter of your fate, both in this life and the next. From the moment you are born, assuming you survive childbirth, which is a whole other terrifying section, you are baptized, cleansing you of original sin and marking you as a member of the Christian community. This isn't just a nice tradition, it's the essential first step on the path to salvation. Throughout your life, the church dictates your calendar. Forget weekends and bank holidays. Your year is structured around feast days, fast days, and the rhythms of the liturgical year. Sunday isn't just a day off, It's a mandatory day of rest, and attendance at Massachusetts' holy days require you to down tools and participate in religious observances. Lent means giving up meat and other indulgences. Good luck finding indulgences in your peasant diet anyway, but the principle is there. Mass itself is a central, non-negotiable part of life. You gather in the local church, which, even in a poor village, is likely the most substantial and decorated building around. The service is conducted in Latin, a language you almost certainly don't understand, by a priest who might be only slightly more educated than you are. The rituals are ancient and mysterious. You watch, you kneel, you cross yourself, you listen to the bells and the chanting, hoping that you're doing it right and that God is pleased. The church building isn't just a place of worship, it's a community center, a safe haven during times of trouble, a place for announcements, and a constant visual reminder of the divine presence in your life. The sheer weight of centuries of faith, ritual, and community gathering within those stone walls, or wattle and daub walls, depending on how fancy your village church is palpable. The church holds immense power, not just spiritually, but temporally. It owns vast amounts of land, collects tithes, a mandatory tenth of your produce or income, like an extra tax, but for your soul, and its bishops and abbots are often powerful feudal lords in their own right. The Pope in Rome is a figure of global authority, capable of influencing kings and emperors. Local priests are respected, feared, and are often the most educated people you will ever encounter. They hold the keys to salvation through the sacraments: baptism, confession, communion, marriage, last rites. If you want to go to heaven, you must participate in these rituals. There is no other path. Your eternal soul literally depends on staying in the church's good graces. And that's where the fear comes in. The medieval worldview is deeply steeped in the reality of heaven and hell. Your life on earth is a brief, difficult test. Pass it by living a good Christian life, obeying the church, and confessing your sins, and you might earn a place in eternal paradise. Fail, and you face the very real, very terrifying prospect of eternal damnation in the fires of hell, often depicted in vivid, horrifying detail in sermons and artwork. The fear of divine judgment, of purgatory, and of eternal torment is a constant, powerful motivator. Every sin, no matter how small, needs to be confessed and atoned for. Imagine living with the constant anxiety that a stray impure thought or a moment of anger could literally condemn you to everlasting agony. It makes worrying about your credit score seem manageable. Alongside formal doctrine, superstition is also rampant and deeply interwoven with religious belief. You might believe in saints who can intercede on your behalf, each with their own specific area of expertise: Saint Anthony for lost things, Saint Sebastian against plague, in the power of relics, a bone fragment or piece of clothing from a saint, believed to possess miraculous power, and in the ever-present threat of demons and the devil. You might wear religious amulets for protection, perform specific rituals to ward off evil spirits, or interpret natural events as signs from God or the devil. Trying to distinguish between formal church teaching and local folk belief is often impossible. They blend together into a complex tapestry of faith, fear, and magical thinking. That black cat crossing your path? Definitely not just a cat. It might be a sign of demonic influence. Better say a prayer. Your modern, secular mindset, your skepticism about miracles, your reliance on scientific explanations, all of it is completely incompatible with this world. Questioning the church is not just impolite, it's heresy, a crime potentially punishable by excommunication, which means you're cut off from the sacraments and doomed to hell. Remember that fear, or, in later periods, by death. Expressing doubt about the existence of God or the devil would be met with horror and possibly violent intervention from your neighbors, who would see you as a danger to the entire community, liable to draw down divine wrath upon everyone. Your freedom of thought is non-existent. You believe, you obey, and you pray, or you face terrifying consequences, both earthly and eternal. It's a level of ideological control that is utterly suffocating to a modern individual. A mainstream historical fact about the medieval church is its role as the single most powerful and pervasive institution in Western Europe. It was not only the spiritual authority but also a major landowner, a key political player, the primary provider of education and charity, limited though they were, and the guardian of knowledge. Its influence extended into every village and every home, shaping laws, customs, and daily life to an extent unparalleled by any modern religious institution. A quirky tidbit you might find fascinating is the medieval belief in the power of curses and blessings, often delivered by clergy, or individuals perceived as having spiritual authority. A priest's blessing could protect you from harm, while a curse from an angry neighbor, especially if they were thought to have occult knowledge, could bring ruin or illness. This highlights how deeply intertwined the spiritual and material worlds were believed to be, with divine and demonic forces actively intervening in daily events. You might find yourself seeking a priest's blessing not just for your soul, but for your crops or your livestock. Historians still argue whether the widespread public displays of piety and adherence to church doctrine in the Middle Ages reflected genuine, deep personal faith for the majority of the population, or if it was largely motivated by social pressure, fear of eternal damnation, and the lack of any viable alternative worldview. Was medieval society truly devout at its core, or was religious observance a necessary performance for survival and social acceptance? Your modern comfort with religious tolerance, diverse beliefs, or even atheism would be utterly incomprehensible and dangerous here. You would be expected to conform, to participate, and to believe, without question. The psychological burden of living under constant religious scrutiny, fearing eternal punishment for even minor transgressions, and having every aspect of your life dictated by religious authority would be immense. You wouldn't last long before the pressure to conform, or the sheer terror of potential damnation, broke you. The church isn't just in your life, it is your life, and trying to live outside its shadow is an impossibility. So you're navigating a world where your eternal fate hinges on adhering to the church's every pronouncement, where your social standing is fixed by birth, and where a simple trip to the next village feels like an expedition to the moon, if the moon were populated by bandits and smelled faintly of pig manure. You're constantly bombarded by threats, physical, spiritual, and social. But surely, with all the hardship, you could at least learn? Figure things out? Access information that might help you survive, or even understand the world around you. Ah, no. Sorry. That's another modern luxury you'll have to leave behind. Welcome to the era of scarce and restricted knowledge. Your modern brain is accustomed to information overload. You have the collective knowledge of humanity at your fingertips, instantly searchable, endlessly accessible. Want to know how to build a fire? There are 10,000 YouTube tutorials. Curious about the symptoms of scurvy? Wikipedia has you covered. Need to calculate the trajectory of a projectile? There's an app for that. In medieval times? Forget it. Information isn't just limited, it's hoarded, controlled, and incredibly difficult to access, particularly for someone like you, a commoner dropped into the bottom layers of society. The most immediate barrier is literacy. The ability to read and write is incredibly rare. For the vast majority of the population, perhaps 90% or more, words on a page are meaningless squiggles. Books are precious, expensive objects, painstakingly copied by hand, often illuminated with intricate artwork, making them treasures to be locked away in monasteries or noble libraries, not casually browsed at the local bookshop, which doesn't exist, by the way. Even if you somehow stumbled upon a written text, you wouldn't be able to decipher it. Your modern ability to read street signs, instructions, or even just a simple note is a superpower here, but one you have almost no opportunity to use, because there's very little written material available to you anyway. The world communicates orally, through sermons, announcements from the Lord's bailiff, gossip in the village square, and stories passed down through generations. This lack of widespread literacy means that knowledge is largely tied to direct experience, oral tradition, and the authority of those who can read, primarily the clergy. The church holds a near monopoly on formal learning. Monasteries are centers of scholarship, preserving ancient texts and producing new ones, usually religious. Bishops and higher clergy are often educated, but their learning is focused on theology, philosophy, often filtered through a religious lens, and the administration of the church's vast affairs. If you have a question about the Bible, the lives of saints, or the intricacies of church law, the priest might be able to help, assuming he's educated enough himself. But if you want to know how the weather patterns work, or why that particular herb is good for a cough, you're more likely to rely on folk wisdom passed down through families, which is a blend of practical experience, superstition, and guesswork. Remember that urine tasting we talked about for diagnosis? Yeah, that's the cutting edge of medical knowledge for many. Formal education as you understand it simply doesn't exist for commoners. There are no public schools. If you're lucky enough to live in a town with a cathedral or a monastery, there might be a small school attached, but places are limited, and it's usually for those destined for the clergy, or from wealthier merchant families. For a peasant child, education consists of learning the skills necessary for survival, farming, domestic chores, perhaps a simple craft, taught by their parents and the community through doing. There's no curriculum, no tests, no graduation ceremony. Your education is your labor. The concept of learning for the sake of learning, of intellectual curiosity as a pursuit in itself, is confined to a tiny elite. Most people are too busy trying not to starve or freeze to worry about expanding their minds. Even for those who do have access to learning, the scope of knowledge is vastly different from today. Science as we know it is embryonic, heavily influenced by classical Greek and Roman texts that are often misunderstood or integrated into a Christian worldview. Astronomy is intertwined with astrology. Chemistry is mixed with alchemy. The understanding of the natural world is based on observation, often inaccurate, and religious explanations. Explaining concepts like gravity, the heliocentric model of the solar system, or the circulation of blood would not only be impossible due to the lack of shared concepts and vocabulary, but potentially dangerous, marking you as a heretic or a madman if your ideas contradicted established church doctrine or classical authority like Aristotle. Your modern understanding of the universe, biology, and physics is completely useless here, because no one would understand you, and it would challenge the fundamental beliefs that hold their world together. Good luck explaining germ theory to someone who thinks illness is caused by bad air or demons. They'd probably just give you some ground-up goat horn and tell you to pray harder. Information about the wider world is also incredibly limited. News travels slowly, by word of mouth, carried by merchants, pilgrims, or messengers. Rumors spread like wildfire, often distorted and mixed with fantasy. Your understanding of what's happening outside your immediate region would be patchy, unreliable, and often months out of date. The concept of a newspaper, a map that accurately depicts distant lands, or a history book based on verifiable evidence is centuries away. Your knowledge of geography, global politics, or even recent events would be laughably inadequate compared to a medieval person who, though illiterate, would have a deep, practical knowledge of their local environment, their community's history, and the obligations owed to their lord. You might know who the current King of England is, maybe, but you wouldn't know the names of your neighbor's children, or which field yielded the best barley last year. Knowledge that is infinitely more important. NT for daily survival. A mainstream historical fact about medieval knowledge is that while formal literacy was low among the general population, particularly peasants, certain groups, such as clergy, merchants, who needed to keep accounts, and some members of the nobility, possessed reading and writing skills to varying degrees. The development of universities from the 11th century onwards marked a significant step in the formalization and expansion of higher learning, but these institutions were exclusive and focused on specific fields like theology, law, and medicine, not general education for the masses. A quirky tidbit you might find interesting is the medieval practice of using mnemonic devices and oral repetition to transmit information. Since writing was rare and expensive, people relied heavily on memory aids like rhymes, songs, and formulaic phrases to remember everything from historical events and legal customs to practical instructions and religious teachings. Imagine having to remember the entire history of your village, your family tree, and all the complicated rules about land use just by hearing them repeated over and over again. It makes remembering your Netflix password seem trivial. Historians still argue whether the medieval period experienced a significant decline in overall knowledge and literacy compared to the classical Roman era, often referred to as a dark age, in popular conception, or if this view is overly simplistic and underestimates the importance and complexity of oral culture, practical knowledge, and the preservation and development of learning within institutions like the church and early universities, suggesting a transformation rather than a wholesale loss of knowledge. Your modern mind, constantly seeking information, verification, and explanation, would be utterly frustrated by the scarcity, unreliability, and control of knowledge in this era. You couldn't just look something up. You couldn't easily verify what you were told. You couldn't access the fundamental understanding of the world that you take for granted. This lack of knowledge doesn't just make life inconvenient, it makes you vulnerable. You don't know why things happen, you can't anticipate threats based on informed analysis, and you're entirely reliant on the limited and often superstitious understanding of those around you. You wouldn't last long before your inability to access and process information left you unable to cope with the unpredictable and inexplicable challenges of medieval life. So you're navigating a world where understanding is limited, where information is a rare commodity, and where every day is a relentless cycle of physical hardship and lurking danger. Your modern brain, used to unwinding with streaming services, video games, or scrolling through endless feeds, is probably screaming for a distraction, a moment of levity, something, anything, that isn't just about basic survival. Surely, medieval people had ways to relax, to enjoy themselves, right? Yes, they did. But your idea of fun is about to get a serious reality check. Welcome to the world of medieval entertainment, which is often simple, sometimes brutal, and frequently involves watching someone else suffer. Forget theme parks, concerts with elaborate light shows, or competitive esports tournaments. Leisure time, when it existed at all, was usually tied to religious festivals, market days, or periods when agricultural work was less demanding, like winter. And the forms of entertainment reflected the realities of the era, physical, local, and often involving communal participation rather than passive consumption. You wouldn't be sitting alone with earbuds in, you'd be out in the thick of it, surrounded by people, smells, and sounds that are, well, very medieval. One of the most common forms of entertainment was simply gathering. People told stories, sang songs, played music, often on instruments that sound a bit rough to modern ears, and danced. These were communal activities, often taking place in the village square, the local tavern, if there was one, and you could afford the questionable ale, or the Lord's Hall during festivals. Storytelling was crucial in a largely illiterate society, keeping history, legends, and morality tales alive. Imagine sitting around a crackling fire on a cold night, listening to someone recount epic tales of knights, saints, or mythical beasts. It's a powerful form of entertainment, but also one that reinforces the dominant cultural and religious narratives. Your favorite podcast doesn't quite capture the same atmosphere, especially when the storyteller might pause to hawk or scratch. Games were also popular, though again, simpler than today. Dice games were common, often leading to gambling and arguments. Board games like chess, a luxury item for the wealthy, or various forms of checkers and backgammon existed. Children played with simple toys like dolls made of rags, wooden tops, or hoops. Archery was a popular pastime and a crucial skill, often practiced competitively. Wrestling and various forms of rough-and-tumble sports were common among men, sometimes resulting in serious injury. Think less organized rugby, more a chaotic brawl in a muddy field. Your modern sports safety equipment? Non-existent. A twisted ankle here is a major problem, remember? But perhaps the most striking difference in medieval entertainment is the prevalence of public spectacles that involved cruelty or danger, which we would find abhorrent today. Public punishments, including executions, were often treated as major events, drawing large crowds. People would gather to watch someone in the stocks, a thief having their hand cut off, or a condemned criminal being hanged. This wasn't just about justice. It was a form of public theater, a grim warning, and disturbingly, a source of morbid fascination and entertainment. Your modern sensibilities, which would recoil at the sight of such suffering, would be utterly out of place among a crowd that might be jeering, throwing refuse, or simply watching with detached curiosity. Animal baiting was also a popular, and brutal, form of entertainment. This involved setting dogs, often specially bred for aggression, against other animals, such as bears or bulls, often chained to a post. The fights were bloody and lasted until one or both animals were dead or severely injured. Cockfighting was another common pastime, involving trained roosters fighting to the death. These activities, which are illegal and considered barbaric in most modern societies, were widely accepted and enjoyed in medieval times. Trying to organize a protest against animal cruelty would likely get you laughed out of town, or worse. What? But the bear hasn't lost an eye yet. The fun's just starting. Tournaments, while primarily a military exercise and a way for knights to train and gain prestige, were also major social events and spectacles. Crowds would gather to watch armored knights engage in jousting, charging at each other with lances, and melees, mock battles involving groups of knights. While governed by rules, sometimes these events were incredibly dangerous, often resulting in serious injury or death for the participants. For the spectators, it was a thrilling, visually impressive display of martial prowess and aristocratic culture, a chance to see famous knights and soak in the atmosphere of chivalry, such as it was. Imagine watching a live sporting event where the participants are actively trying to kill each other, and that's roughly the vibe. Makes watching extreme sports on TV seem positively sedate. Even religious events could have elements of spectacle. Mystery plays and morality plays, dramatic performances depicting biblical stories or moral allegories, were popular forms of entertainment, often performed by guilds or community groups. While their purpose was primarily religious education, they offered a form of public theater in a world without dedicated playhouses. A mainstream historical fact about medieval entertainment is the central role of public festivals and fairs. These events, often tied to religious holidays or agricultural cycles, were crucial opportunities for communities to gather, trade, socialize, and enjoy rare periods of leisure through music, dancing, games, and various forms of spectacle. They broke the monotony of daily life and reinforced social bonds. A quirky tidbit you might find surprising is the existence of traveling entertainers like minstrels, jongleur, and acrobats. These performers would move from town to town, offering a variety of entertainment, from singing songs and reciting poetry to juggling, acrobatics, and even training animals to perform tricks. They were often viewed with a mixture of suspicion and fascination, living on the fringes of society but providing a vital source of novelty and amusement in a world where travel and new experiences were rare. Imagine seeing a street performer with a trained monkey being the highlight of your year's entertainment. Historians still argue whether the medieval fascination with public suffering and violent spectacles reflected a fundamentally different, more callous attitude towards pain and death compared to modern sensibilities, or if it was a coping mechanism born of a harsh world where death and suffering were constant companions, making people more desensitized or even finding a strange form of release in witnessing it. Your modern idea of entertainment, focused on comfort, safety, and personal choice, would be completely incompatible with the forms of leisure available here. You'd be expected to find amusement in activities that are physically demanding, socially prescribed, or involve witnessing acts of cruelty. The sheer lack of variety, the communal nature of everything, meaning no quiet nights in, and the often brutal element of medieval entertainment would be yet another source of culture shock and discomfort. You wouldn't last long before you were either deeply disturbed by what you were witnessing or forced to participate in activities that went against your modern moral code, just to fit in or find a moment of respite. So you've navigated the baffling social maze, dodged the local lord's arbitrary justice, and witnessed entertainment that makes modern reality TV look like a nature documentary. You're probably thinking, okay, I just need to keep my head down, work hard, and maybe I can carve out a quiet existence. And then the sky opens up, or the sun beats down relentlessly, and you realize that even nature itself isn't a benign force you can simply ignore or control with a thermostat. Your modern life has insulated you from the raw, unpredictable power of the elements in a way that medieval people could never imagine. Battling unpredictable nature isn't a weekend camping trip, it's a constant, daily struggle for survival. Your dwelling, whether it's a simple peasant cottage or slightly more substantial townhouse, offers only the most basic protection from the weather. Remember those wattle and daub walls and thatch roofs. They're better than nothing, certainly, but they are far from airtight or perfectly insulated. In the winter, the cold seeps in through every crack and crevice. Your only source of heat is usually an open hearth, a fire burning in the center of the room or against one wall. It provides some warmth, but much of the heat escapes through the smoke hole in the roof, your medieval chimney, such as it was, and it fills the space with smoke, stinging your eyes and coating everything in soot. Trying to get genuinely warm is a constant effort, requiring significant amounts of precious firewood, which you probably had to spend hours gathering or chopping yourself. Imagine trying to sleep through a freezing night with drafts whistling through the walls and your breath misting in the air, huddled under thin blankets that smell faintly of smoke and damp wool. Your concept of cozy winter night, involving central heating and hot chocolate, is utterly alien here. Summers can be equally brutal. While not all medieval regions experienced scorching heatwaves like some modern climates, warm weather brings its own miseries. Without air conditioning or even electric fans, your dwelling can become stiflingly hot and stuffy. Small windows provide little ventilation, and opening them wide just lets in flies, dust, and the pervasive smells from outside. Trying to work in the fields under a blazing sun, with heavy, coarse clothing and no readily available source of clean, cool water, is physically exhausting and dangerous. Heat stroke is a real risk, and there's no quick trip to an air-conditioned emergency room. You learn to seek shade when possible, work during the cooler parts of the day, if your Lord allows it, and simply endure the discomfort. Wishing for a nice blast of cold air from your car's AC feels like a fever dream from another planet. But beyond personal discomfort, unpredictable weather has far more serious consequences. It directly impacts the food supply. Remember that monotonous, grain-heavy diet we talked about. It relies entirely on the success of the harvest. And harvests are incredibly vulnerable to the whims of nature. Too much rain? Crops rot in the fields, seeds are washed away, or flooding destroys everything. Too little rain? Drought withers the plants, turning potential food into dry stalks. A late frost can kill young shoots in the spring, while an early frost can ruin ripening grain in the fall. Hailstorms can flatten entire fields in minutes. Pests, like swarms of locusts or infestations of rodents, can devour crops regardless of the weather. There is very little you can do to mitigate these natural disasters. You don't have irrigation systems to water crops during a drought, not widespread ones for peasants, anyway. You don't have pesticides to protect against infestations. You don't have access to different crop varieties that might be more resistant to local conditions, or the knowledge of soil science to improve yields. Your farming methods are basic, traditional, and entirely at the mercy of the sky. It's like gambling your entire year's income, and your family's survival, on a dice roll controlled by the weather gods. When the harvest fails, the consequences are catastrophic. Famine is a very real, recurring threat in medieval times. It's not just about going hungry for a few days, it's widespread starvation. Prices for grain skyrocket, putting it out of reach for the poor. People are forced to eat whatever they can find, roots, bark, even desperate, unsanitary things that make that questionable pottage seem like a gourmet meal. Malnutrition weakens bodies, making them more susceptible to disease. And remember how terrifying medieval medicine is? Famine and disease often go hand in hand, sweeping through populations already weakened by lack of food. People might abandon their homes in search of food elsewhere, becoming desperate refugees, adding to the instability and danger of travel. The social order can break down as hunger drives people to desperate acts. A bad year isn't just an economic downturn, it's a potential death sentence for you and everyone you know. Even seemingly less dramatic weather events can have significant impacts. A particularly harsh winter can kill livestock, a vital source of food and labor. A wet spring can delay planting, shortening the growing season. The lack of reliable weather forecasting beyond very short-term observations, and maybe some folk wisdom about cloud formations or animal behavior, means you are constantly reacting, never truly prepared for what nature might throw at you next. Your modern weather app, which can tell you the forecast for the next 10 days with surprising accuracy, feels like a piece of impossible magic in this world. A mainstream historical fact about the medieval period is that its economy and society were profoundly vulnerable to climate fluctuations. Periods of favorable climate, like the medieval warm period, roughly 950–1250 AD, contributed to population growth and agricultural expansion in some regions. Conversely, cooler and more volatile periods, such as the early stages of the Little Ice Age, which began in the later Middle Ages, were associated with crop failures, famines, like the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, and increased hardship for the population, highlighting the direct link between climate and survival. A quirky tidbit you might notice is the reliance on weather omens and rituals. People paid close attention to signs in nature, the behavior of birds, the appearance of clouds, the phases of the moon, interpreting them as indicators of future weather. They also performed religious rituals, processions, and prayers specifically asking for good weather, sufficient rain, or protection from storms, reflecting the deep belief that nature's power was ultimately controlled by divine forces or perhaps influenced by supernatural ones. Imagine trying to explain meteorology to someone who thinks a lightning strike is a sign of God's anger or a demon's mischief. Historians still argue whether the impact of climate change on medieval society was primarily a direct cause of major crises like famines and plagues, or if climate fluctuations acted more as a stress multiplier, exacerbating existing vulnerabilities in social structures, economic systems, and public health infrastructure that were already precarious. Was it the climate itself that brought about disaster, or did it simply reveal the inherent fragility of medieval life? Living in medieval times means accepting that your life is fundamentally dictated by forces far beyond your control, the will of your Lord, the dictates of the Church, and the unpredictable fury or benevolence of nature. There's no escaping it, no technological fix, no government safety net. You are constantly exposed, constantly vulnerable to the elements, and keenly aware that a single bad season could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Your modern ability to just stay inside or order groceries during bad weather is not an option. You wouldn't last long before the sheer physical and psychological toll of battling unpredictable nature wore you down or wiped you out entirely. So you've battled the relentless physical demands, the pervasive stench, the terrifying medical practices, the arbitrary justice, the perils of travel, the crushing social structure, the looming threat of war, the suffocating influence of religion, the scarcity of knowledge, the brutal forms of entertainment, and the raw, unforgiving power of nature. You're probably physically exhausted, covered in a film of grime that feels permanently fused to your skin, and constantly slightly afraid. But beyond all the external challenges, there's another layer of medieval misery that would absolutely break your modern spirit, the sheer, cumulative mental toll of existence. Your modern mind, accustomed to mental health days, therapy, and personal boundaries, is about to face a relentless psychological gauntlet you are utterly unprepared for. Think about everything we've discussed, but now consider the weight of it all bearing down on your psyche, day after day, with no end in sight. You are never truly clean. Remember that lovely floor rush you're sleeping on? You are never truly comfortable. You are often hungry, and when you do eat, it's monotonous and potentially dangerous. Every ache and pain triggers a silent panic, because medieval medicine is more terrifying than the disease itself. Your body is in constant pain from the backbreaking labor, pain you just have to push through, because stopping means starvation. There's no concept of taking a break or listening to your body when your body is the only tool you have, and it belongs, in many ways, to your Lord. The lack of privacy is a constant, low-grade stressor. You live cheek by jowl with your family, neighbors, and sometimes even animals. There are no private bedrooms, no quiet corners to retreat to, no locked doors to create personal space. Every conversation can be overheard, every personal habit observed. Imagine trying to process the overwhelming shock of this new reality, or simply have a moment to yourself to cry or think, when you are literally never alone. Your modern need for solitude and personal boundaries feels not just impossible, but utterly ridiculous to the people around you, who are used to this constant, inescapable proximity. It's like living in a perpetual, slightly smelly, very crowded sleepover, except everyone is also stressed about the harvest failing. The crushing weight of limited prospects would be incredibly demoralizing. Remember the rigid social hierarchy? Knowing that your life is largely predetermined by your birth, that there is virtually no chance of improving your status, that your children will likely face the same brutal existence, it steals hope. Your modern belief that you can achieve anything if you work hard enough is a cruel joke here. Hard work is expected, but it rarely leads to advancement beyond perhaps accumulating a few more chickens or a slightly better plot of land, still under the Lord's thumb. The sheer, soul-crushing monotony of knowing that tomorrow will be just like today, and the day after that, and the day after that, until you are too old or broken to work, is a psychological burden that would be incredibly difficult to bear. There's no retirement plan, no pension, just a slow decline into dependency or destitution if your family can't or won't support you. And the fear. Oh, the fear. It's not just the occasional spike of anxiety you might feel today. It's a constant, low-level hum of dread underlying everything. Fear of bandits on the road. Fear of your Lord's arbitrary justice. Fear of illness and death. Fear of famine if the crops fail. Fear of warfare sweeping through your village. Fear of offending the church or incurring divine wrath for a perceived sin, condemning your immortal soul to eternal torment. Remember how real hell felt? You are constantly vulnerable, constantly aware of how easily everything you have, your life, your family, your meager possessions, can be taken away by forces entirely beyond your control. There's no safety net, no insurance, number 911 to call. You are utterly exposed, and your mind would be in a perpetual state of high alert, constantly scanning for threats, constantly worrying about the next disaster. It's like living with chronic, unmanaged anxiety, but the threats are all very real and very deadly. The lack of reliable information and understanding of the world adds to this mental burden. Not knowing why people get sick, or why the crops failed, or why the weather is so extreme leaves you feeling powerless and reliant on superstition or explanations that make no sense to your modern brain. You can't problem solve effectively because you lack the fundamental knowledge base. You are trapped in a world where bad things just happen, and the best you can do is pray and hope you aren't the next victim. Trying to apply logic or reason to a world governed by faith, tradition, and brute force would be mentally exhausting and deeply isolating. Your modern coping mechanisms, talking things through, seeking professional help, distracting yourself with media, are non-existent. How do you process trauma or chronic stress in a world that doesn't even have words for mental health? You likely just endure, internalize, or perhaps turn to the limited comforts available, like alcohol or the bleak communal entertainments we discussed. A mainstream historical fact about the psychological realities of medieval life is that while the concept of mental illness as a medical condition was not understood as it is today, medieval societies recognized states of madness, melancholy, and other forms of psychological distress, although these were often interpreted through religious or supernatural lenses, seen as demonic possession, divine punishment, or an imbalance of humors, leading to treatments that might involve exorcism, religious rituals, or physical interventions rather than what we would consider psychological support. A quirky tidbit that might offer a glimpse into coping mechanisms is the medieval tradition of pilgrimages. While undertaken for religious reasons, penance, seeking miraculous cures, venerating saints, the arduous journey itself, the separation from daily life, and the shared experience with other pilgrims might have offered a form of psychological release, a break from the intense pressures of home, even if the journey itself was physically demanding and dangerous. It was perhaps one of the few socially acceptable ways to temporarily escape the confines of your normal existence, even if it was framed entirely within a religious context. Historians still argue whether the psychological resilience of medieval people was inherently greater than that of modern individuals, conditioned by a lifetime of hardship and lack of alternatives, or if they experienced similar levels of psychological distress but expressed it differently, or simply suppressed it due to societal norms and the overwhelming demands of survival, making it harder for us to identify and understand from historical records. Your modern mind, fragile from decades of comfort, safety nets, and the expectation of personal fulfillment would likely buckle under the relentless, cumulative stress of medieval existence. The constant fear, the lack of control, the absence of privacy, the crushing monotony, the sheer physical exhaustion, and the inability to escape or even fully comprehend the hardships would create a psychological burden that you are simply not equipped to handle. You wouldn't last long before the sheer mental toll overwhelmed you, leaving you unable to function in a world that demands absolute resilience just to survive another day. And with that thought, the weight of this journey back in time starts to lift ever so slowly. The harsh edges of the medieval world begin to soften, the smells fade, the sounds quieten. You can feel the rough straw beneath you giving way to something much softer, much more familiar. The distant clang of the blacksmith and the bleating of sheep recede, replaced by a gentle hum, perhaps the fan you turned on earlier. The perpetual ache in your body eases, the grime on your skin seems to melt away. The fear, the hunger, the cold, the constant anxiety, they are no longer immediate sensations, but echoes, fading whispers from a reality thankfully far removed from your own. Breathe in. That's clean air. Feel the softness beneath you. That's a comfortable bed. The silence around you? That's privacy. The knowledge that you can access information, call for help, seek comfort, and plan for a future not dictated by birthright or the whims of nature, that's the gentle, reassuring magic of the modern world. You are safe. You are warm. You are home. The journey is over. Rest now.